one young man and two old men who are the same person. The central figure of Matthew 1 is a different person, however. And from quite early on, most observers have seen this individual as a kind of low-born peasant figure, recognizable as such both by his physiognomy and by his homespun cloak. Indeed, it is one of the standard explanations for the rejection of the picture, though there's no real contemporary documentation that this was the reason. I see salvation, just like Matthew. It's one of the standard explanations for the rejection of the picture that the original viewers couldn't tolerate such a blue-collar evangelist. Now we're in a position to understand the writing-centered plot of Matthew 1. An analphabetic boor is producing text in a manner worthy of the most learned Renaissance humanist calligrapher. Indeed, as I read it, he seems astonished and uncomprehending as regards his own actions. How is all this possible? Obviously by the direct intervention of the divine. And yet, whereas the angel in this picture is spectacularly otherworldly, the means of intervention is almost laughably mechanical, with the delicate angelic hand atop the stubby paw of the evangelist, which is itself clenched in such a way that he couldn't write anything, let alone exquisitely formed letters in an exotic foreign script. As a theological point, and this indeed may be part of the controversy that the picture occasioned, this represents a particular take on the question of human and divine agency. As a statement by someone who produces one sort of marks on a tablet concerning the production of a different sort of marks on a tablet, that is pictures versus words, it turns into an entry in the long-running battle of prestige between writers and artists, which takes us to Matthew 2. The difference in the relationship of the apostle and the angel, as between the first and second painting, is glaringly obvious, and it's often cited as probable cause, again, for the substitution, via a variety of explanations from the erotic to the theological. It's interesting to point out that there is a general tendency in late Renaissance versions of this subject to complicate the relationship of the two figures, as for example in this Bronzino version or in this Savondo version. Be that as it may, Caravaggio, as it were, cleaned up his act in Matthew 2, at once eliminating any sense of physical intimacy between the figures and leaving the viewer with no doubt that Matthew was himself responsible for the text of the gospel, with only a very abstract form of inspiration. In an iconography borrowed from a whole set of classical representations in which a human is accompanied by a personal daemon or genius, or anointed by a figure of victory, as in this figure from the column of Antoninus Pius. That may be what Caravaggio did for his clerical patrons. What he did for himself, it seems to me, is to offer an entry into the long-running sibling rivalry of the sister arts. Matthew 2 downplays the book and eliminates writing altogether. The angel himself is an extraordinary tour de force of painting, and his completely non-alphabetic intervention is itself untranslatable beyond the visual medium in which it is presented. I note parenthetically that it owes something to Raphael's school of Athens, specifically the hand gesture of the figure universally identified as Socrates, whose physiognomy, just to complicate matters, absolutely resembles the Matthew of the first picture, but not the second. Indeed, the first Matthew makes unquestionable reference, and others have seen this, to a whole descendancy of Socrates's, which is interesting, since the Athenian sage is most famous as a non-writer. Returning to these sister arts battles, the trump card of the writers was always that they operated in the ethereal realm of the abstract, whereas the visual artists were, in the first place, engaged in the gross material realm of paint and stone, and in the second place, operating in a realm of slavish reproduction. Matthew turns those tables, leaving his predecessor in the earthbound realm of physical labor, while he enjoys all the abstraction of mysterious insight. I don't think that the artist wants us to imagine that the second St. Matthew is literally about to paint rather than write the gospel, but I do think that Caravaggio is painting the fantasy scene of his own artistic inspiration. 2. marginality, early modern sexuality. The second of my three vignettes comes from a trans aspect of my work that I haven't so far mentioned, which is a set of interests that might well be deduced from a review of figures in my CV. Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Ganymede, see where we're going here. I'm speaking, of course, about alternative sexualities, unmentioned in the introduction by Professor Asselman. Anyway, and if I begin, but I'm out, what can I tell you? It's because and if I begin with those proper names instead of a phrase like alternative sexualities, it's because the question of naming is particularly fraught. In fact, it's that question that I want to talk about. Movements of liberation have properly devoted a lot of energy to names, not only anathematizing nasty names, but also understanding how all names, whether ill-intentioned or not, carry complex implications. Parallel work needs to be done, and has been done, in understanding past names. And in the case of same-sex desire, the matter has been particularly fraught, since terms like homosexual and gay beg all sorts of questions about the ways in which we should read the experience of the pre-moderns. I hope to cut through this Gordian knot with a quite humble intervention regarding a single individual, a person who was enormously famous, extensively documented, and widely known to be sexually outside the mainstream. I'm speaking, of course, of Michelangelo. And I'm asking what kinds of words get used about him, or around him, or by him, as regards what we would call his homosexuality. The topic places us immediately at a crossroads between two quite distinct scenes of same-sex desire. On the one hand, there is the relationship with the immensely attractive Roman nobleman Tommaso Cavalieri, 35 years his junior, whom Michelangelo met in 1532 and remained close to until his own death in 1564. On the other hand, there are several decades worth of connections, I use the most non-specific term I can find, connections, with a succession of boys or men, presumably even younger than Cavalieri, or at any rate far less worthy of being considered the artist's equal. Much could be said about, or indeed against, this distinction, but I'm going to barrel through that territory and simply say that I'm concentrating on the relations with boys, let's call them boys, because I'm deliberately focusing on a vernacular language in which Michelangelo's contemporaries communicated on the subject of his desires, which generally also means the language of those who did not necessarily share his, again, our word, orientation. And this puts aside the dozens and dozens of platonically inspired poems, that has to do with the part I'm not talking about, and a certain amount of platonic discourse, although we will touch upon it, that comes from others surrounding him. The question of naming arises as soon as we try to place Michelangelo inside the immediate milieu of his living and working. Everyone was aware that he did not keep the traditional sort of studio, like say Raphael or Bandinelli, with a steady group of younger men who acted as apprentice assistants, which is to say, both aiding in the work and learning to become artists like the master. He didn't have that. There was, at different times, depending on the project, a sizable number of helpers doing manual work, but there was another group, not, I think, overlapping with that group, who were clearly unclassifiable, as witness Vasari's terminological difficulties. After listing the significant artists who were Michelangelo's friends, among whom Vasari names himself, the life goes on to talk about some less significant associates. But it's clear he doesn't know quite what to call them. Sliding from suoi familiari, his familiars, to a chi dimandava consiglio, those who asked him for counsel, to finally, my favorite, coloro che steccono con seco in casa, which is the most hopeless, those who stayed with him in his house. It's no surprise that this would be a problem for Vasari. Artistic succession, and I should say, nowhere there does he suggest anything sexual about it. Others do. Artistic succession, after all, is the central ideological principle in the lives of the artists. But instead of a list of successors, which is a frequent figure elsewhere in his biographies, Vasari in this case is stuck with these young men